Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. As I was thinking about what to discuss, I realized that as I looked at the incredibly impressive list of people who were coming, I realized that a lot of you have heard me speak, and I didn't feel like you should hear me speak about the same thing as you've heard me speak about before. So those of you who know my work know that I work on digital inequality, and I will relate my talk to that topic. And in fact, Lisa and I didn't coordinate our talks, but they go together really nicely. However, what I'm going to do is I want to take it a step further in the sense of trying to convince you guys why, even if you're not interested in social stratification, digital inequality and that perspective is actually relevant to your work, probably. Not everybody is as engaging as Lisa is when talking about questions of social inclusion and social exclusion, so I think people's eyes often glaze over when moving up at the topic of digital inequality, so that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this. So I will start with a digital inequality slide. I created this, well, part of it I borrowed, but the rest I drew, and you could probably guess which part I drew. So I created this slide over a decade ago as I was working on digital inequality questions, and the idea was that well over a decade ago, when the internet started diffusing to the wider public, there was a lot of excitement about it, how it was going to solve all our problems of inequality. Of course, we know that that's not the case. But what's interesting is even well into a decade after we've had the internet and we've been doing research on the internet, and this is actually a point Barry started with, there's still a lot of this approach of, oh, it's so great. And that might have been the approach 15 years ago, but what's crazy is that it's still the approach of a lot of people out there, and a lot of the well-selling books take this very binary approach of, wow, the internet is just fantastic for the reasons I list. Or there's this opposite perspective, which is still also seems to result in very popular books, which is that we should be really afraid of the internet and we should be really concerned because it screws up everything. That's sort of a summary. But of course, this is way too simplistic, and most of us here know this, but I did want to mention it. And so a graphical representation of that previous slide is basically either the internet is all awesome, so it's a smiley, or the internet is all bad, so we've got a frown. What's convenient is that if you actually take a smiley and a frowny, they make up a Venn diagram. And so the idea is, the reason I bring up this Venn diagram is that in reality I think the better way to think about the internet's social, political, economic, cultural implications is to recognize that it all matters on the context, right? It's not going to be one or the other. It will depend on the situation. It'll depend on the users. It'll depend on their social context. So that's the framework that I think is incredibly important to apply, pretty much regardless of the questions you're asking. And that may be a little vague, so in a minute I'll get a little bit more specific. But so the general framework that I'm working with, and you'll see that there's a bit of a bias as I'm a sociologist, and so I think you can see that in the model that I show here. But we start out with the user and recognize that the user, and consciously are aware of the fact that the user, as Lisa also discussed, has all sorts of characteristics, whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, recognize that that person is a certain socioeconomic status, but then also think consciously about the context of their uses, both technical and social. So in technical terms, what I mean is, right, it's not about whether you have access to the internet, which is really what the question was over a decade ago, and we thought, oh, once you do, that's great, and all is set. Rather, we have more and more gadgets. Gadgets could do very different things. Who has access to which gadgets should matter, probably matters. We know it matters, in fact, from all sorts of data. And then the social context will matter, right? What level of autonomy do you have in using the medium? Are people staring at you all the time because you're in a library and you can't ever really use it privately? Do you have people you can turn to for help when you run into problems? Those contextual variables should likely matter. And then what I've argued for over a decade now, and have collected lots of data on, is that skill matters, that people have very different skills in using the internet. And being able to do things will determine how they're able to make use of their access. And by skill, I want to say just a couple words about what I mean by skill. People use very different terms to think about this construct. I think about it in a very broad way. I think about it from anything starting with even the mere awareness and understanding of what is possible to do. I didn't realize this would be that important until I started doing data collection 10 years ago on this topic, and it was clear that people have very different cognitive maps of what's even possible with the internet, and that continues today. So even that is a type of skill. And then we have other more concrete skills, such as, are you able to look up the information that you need? Are you able to assess the credibility of the content you access? Are you able to control your privacy security the way that you want to? And then all these factors will influence what people actually do online. And in the early years, it was more about consumption. And then as time passed, a lot of it became also about production. But again, very much related to scale. Are you able to put your content out there, get people to see it, get people to engage with it? Now, one argument some people make is that over time, people catch up. What's interesting is that the little data we have on this suggests that people's skill over time actually doesn't change that much per se. Some people's might. One of the questions I think that remains is understanding why it is that some people's skills might improve and other people's might not. But the other issue is that the internet itself keeps progressing and changing. And that means that the skills you needed 5 years ago to be efficient at using it will not be enough to be an efficient user today. So even if people are catching up, there are always the new skills that the really savvy ones will be able to apply to their uses that others are lacking. And then ultimately, the really big questions are, how do people's internet uses then loop back into their life chances? So whether that's their well-being, socioeconomic status, various achievements. I also want to note that those of you who have seen me give talks know that my talks are usually very data heavy and my work is very empirical. Actually, this is one of the first times that I'm speaking without too much data, but I assure you that any empirical comments I make, I can back up with references. And feel free to follow up with me about that. I felt a little uneasy about it, but this was a way to fit more in. Okay, so I said that I get a little more concrete about what I mean with respect to people asking big questions. They're not very specific about context. So here are a few questions that people, that lots of researchers and just people in general asking about the internet and its social implications. So for example, we're interested in how online participation may relate to political participation or the democratization of the public sphere. What's interesting is that in many of these cases, the question itself seems to assume that there's a universal response to that. It will either augment political participation, it being the internet or not. The approach seems to assume that the answer will be the same regardless of the person. Another example is, what are the effects of playing video games on health or on academic achievement? But again, the question, even the way we ask the questions often, and certainly the way they tend to be studied, assume a universal outcome. And just one more, how might your privacy settings and concerns reflect the extent to which you share content and participate in content creation online? So to get even more concrete, let's say you are interested in this question of political participation and how it relates to internet uses. Let's say you gather some data. And the time here on the x-axis, the idea is that we introduce the internet and various online services, so how might that change things? Okay, well let's say that you find that thanks to the internet, people's political participation has gone up. But if you're not looking at who those people are that you've examined, it may be that it turns out that your answer only applies to a certain population. Let's say people who are in a more privileged position in society. And let's say if you had data on people who are less privileged, you'd find that their participation hasn't actually gone up. But oops, you didn't have data because your research design didn't allow for looking at people who weren't participating. Okay, maybe this is a little extreme and you're going to argue that, well, it's not fair to say that their participation isn't going to go up at all. Fine. Let's say their participation went up some. You could walk away and say, it's great, the internet has resulted in more participation. Okay. In core numbers, that may be right. But if you look at the differences between those in less privileged positions and those who are better off, those who are better off may be much better off now. So if you're actually interested in the democratization of the public sphere in the sense that everyone's really more engaged, in the sense that those who are less privileged are catching up with those who are more privileged, then maybe your initial conclusion was actually wrong, because maybe the situation is actually worse than it was. Now, instead of political participation, we could have all sorts of other questions that we could be asking as the outcome, right? So these are just some examples. And one of the things that has happened more and more is people, so what happens though is that often it's easiest to gather data on those who are the most active, the ones who are participating more, the ones who are sharing more, the ones who are the most present on those sites and services that we're interested in. And so technically speaking, what this means, so often what happens, and I think especially with graduate students, partly because of lack of resources, but I think this happens all over the discipline, well, what discipline? All over the area of internet studies, is that people, quote unquote, sample on the dependent variable, right? So people choose their cases biased towards the question of interest. And then what this means is that by design, due to the research design, you're excluding partly the people who are less active in those activities that are of interest to you, or worse, you're completely excluding those who just don't participate at all, right? Who are at the zero level. Okay, so partly what we've seen is more and more research that focuses on users of a specific site. And the reason for this is, well, it's great, we have all these data, right? So one of the great opportunities that have come about in the last decade is that all these data are being collected automatically about people's online actions. That's very convenient because all the data are there, but it can be tricky depending on the questions you're asking, right? All the sites I have up there, I'm quite sure have served as the basis of different studies out there that get a lot of press coverage as well. But you have to remember when you use a site as the sample base, you're excluding those people who are a zero on that access, right? So people who are not on that site in the first place. So you could say, well, if people randomly select into sites, it doesn't matter. Great, but people don't randomly select into the use of sites. And this is where hopefully I can get through these sites quicker because Lisa already covered them. So as I've done work on this and others, like Dana, people don't select into the use of sites randomly. So for example, several have shown over the years that use of Facebook, use of MySpace is related to one's race or ethnicity. So let's say in 2007 you were doing a study and you based your sample on Facebook users, you were biasing against Hispanic users. I should clarify, these data come specifically from an American university, not my own, that's very, very diverse. And I did not do the data collection online or based on an online sample.
What does NH mean?
Oh, sorry, not Hispanic. Not Hispanic, white, not Hispanic, African American, not Hispanic, Asian American. So that US race classifications. By 2009, this changed, but we still see that even 2 years later, even at a time when people really thought Facebook use was completely universal, we still see differences by ethnicity. Another example is about Twitter. Now, with respect to Twitter, you may have seen similar figures. This wasn't particularly new that we found this paper that I wrote with Eden Lit. We found that African Americans are more likely to be on Twitter than others. This is, again, young American sample. Okay, well, again, this wasn't that exciting because others have already found this. Then what? What was exciting is that we actually had longitudinal data. We had data about the same people from 2009 and 2010. So we were able to look at what 2009 characteristics predicted adoption of Twitter by 2010. In 2009, almost nobody in the sample was using Twitter. So not surprisingly, we found that being African American meant that people were more likely to adopt Twitter. However, some of the issues that people hypothesize about when they hear that blacks use Twitter more is that, oh, well, they're more likely to have smartphones, or they text a lot, text more. Those are empirical questions, and people talk about these ideas, but they rarely have data. We had data, we checked, that didn't predict adoption of Twitter. We had data on skill from a year prior, and it turns out people who were more skilled a year prior were more likely to use Twitter in 2010. What we also had data on was interest in different topics. And so what we found was, not only was interest in entertainment and celebrity news positively related to adopting Twitter, it basically explained away the racial difference. So if you take a white person in the sample and an African American person in the sample who have the same level of interest in entertainment and celebrity news, they were equally likely to adopt Twitter. So there was no longer a racial difference there. Regarding that political participation and interest question, I'll also note that we found that interest in news and politics had no relation to adoption of Twitter. So I just thought I'd mention that. I will emphasize that this is young adult US sample, very well not generalized to all ages. I also want to mention, for the record, that while today when you go to Twitter, this is what you see, you might think, oh, well, that's not a big deal, they thought to look at interest. I will note that when I first thought to look at interest, this is what Twitter's homepage looked like. So I don't know how they decided that interest is what their site is about, but whatever their data thoughts were, our data could also show this even before they thought to make that as part of their marketing. So back to these different outcomes of interest, linking this to digital inequality scholarship, the way I look at these questions, all of these questions are ways to think about who can benefit from the internet uses more. And the question being, can we make sure that people are benefiting at equal levels and it's not just the privileged who are gaining more and more from being online? And one of the completely uniform findings from very different studies I've done, and I've done quite a few, is that skill always seems to matter. That is, if you're higher skilled, you do more things. Now, of course, partly this is tricky because you do more things, you get more skilled. This is where longitudinal data are really helpful. So why do I keep focusing on skill? Well, partly it matters, but partly it's also because that's actually a place where we can maybe change things, right? So you're not going to go around changing people's genders just because they use the internet differently. And while we might want to improve people's socioeconomic status, it's not really trivial to do so either. Skill, however, is the kind of thing where you can intervene. And that's, I think, another area where it would be great to see more research, and we need more research. We did do a small pilot study, it was a small study where we did a random assignment training intervention. So basically, we randomly assigned students, the same types of students who were in the survey study, to a training, just a very bare bones 1 hour of training, getting better about evaluating the source or the content that they access online. And then what we did was, a few months later, we observed them using the internet, asked them some questions, and looked at how they did finding information and evaluating the content credibility of material they saw. So one of the questions we asked them had to do with finding some information about Martin Luther King Jr. Now what happens when you do a search on Google, which is what most students use, on Martin Luther King, one of the top results on Google, lower actually on the other search engines, is martinlutherking.org. Now I don't know who's familiar with this site. Actually, I'm just curious, can you raise your hand if you've, okay, so not too many, but a few. I became familiar with this website when a student of mine years ago used it as a source for her homework assignment. And I was skeptical about some of the material that showed up in that homework assignment. I looked into the site. I didn't want to be too judgmental about the student. I thought maybe the site actually reflects her position. But when I pointed out to her what the site was, it turned out she had no idea. So what is the site? Well, this is the site. It looks reasonable. Although if you start looking at some of those headings, you'll probably realize that something like Jews and civil rights doesn't quite belong on a page about Martin Luther King, and you might become skeptical. So if you scroll down to the bottom of the site, you get a link to Stormfront, which is sponsored by this organization. Once you know this, you might be skeptical about the content you find on martinlutherking.org.
Can't see it.
Oh, sorry, it says White Pride Worldwide.
It's a Ku Klux Klan. They do this.
Yeah, so it might not be your go-to source for information about Martin Luther King Jr. but it's not that obvious on the page, right? So what we had done, or what I had done since I did all these training sessions, in the training was we actually had looked at the specific site, we had talked about the sources, so it was very specialized training to be sure. But several months later, as I said, we brought people back. We had them look at dozens of, answer about a dozen questions, different topics. And one of them was, give us information about Martin Luther King Jr. And it turned out that only one of the people who had done the training decided to use this site, but about half of the people who had not gone through training decided to use this site. So the training was successful, but again, it was extremely targeted in some ways. So I think this basically means that training has potential, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done as to what that training should be. So just a few words about where I think we need to be headed. So I think we need longitudinal data. Oh, as to where we need to be headed for what? Well, where we need to be headed in terms of studying how people use the internet and understanding the social implications of people's digital media uses. So one, we need longitudinal data. A lot of the questions we're asking require it. It's understandable that with a new field, in the beginning we don't have data of that sort, and we do a lot of descriptive work, but we need to move forward. We also need to start digging deeper. We do need to stay conscious of the basic characteristics of users we're looking at, right? So I maintain that I think it's very important to look at gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. But I think we also need to go deeper into what might be motivating or explaining different actions. I think we need to test interventions like the one I just mentioned. Of course, these are all pretty expensive propositions. And then finally, it's really important to think very carefully about research design. And for the graduate students in the room, I mean, I often tell my students that I will listen to the first 5 minutes of a job talk, and if it turns out that the research design was faulty, I pretty much tune out, because I cannot take for granted anything that the students or the candidate says after that point. And I'm not saying that everybody is quite as harsh, but I think it's important to recognize that if you have a bad research design, that basically means that you don't know what to do with whatever your findings might be. Of course, a really big challenge here is that most of the things I outlined as next steps are incredibly expensive and require a lot of resources. And not only graduate students, but a lot of faculty don't necessarily have the resources required. So what do? I think we need more collaboration. We actually have a ton of collaboration, to be sure, but I think we could use more. Also at the point of when we construct instruments to figure out what to do. So specifically I'm thinking about survey research, but this applies to all sorts of other research, right? This would apply also if you're trying to get data from an organization and what type of data you should get and how you approach those data. We need to be talking before we gather the data so we know that the questions and the way the design actually addresses different people's needs and interests. And then we need to share data. So OI is great, right? iCS is actually available to people, and that's excellent. I'm not sure how many people actually know that, though, right? So I think publicizing that we have data to share when we have data to share is also very important. And then I think we need to do better about valuing work that's based on secondary data. I think this is very field specific. I'm now in communication, and it seems to me that their primary data are often assumed or required, whereas in other fields like sociology, political science, economics, it's pretty standard for people, students especially, to use secondary data. That can be still a lot of work. The advantage is that the student doesn't have the resources to collect those data, right? And so again, if we could, as a community, pool resources to gather data that then many people could use, I think we could get further than each of us separately can in terms of addressing some of the questions that we have to be looking at. So to wrap up, I think it says something about the continued relevance of traditional media that both Lisa and I have picked a cover of time to incorporate into our presentations. So my commentary on this cover of time that was about the importance of you is that, in fact, it's not really you, all you, it's some of you, and really it's some of us in this room. And I think what we need to realize is that we set when we pick research questions and we decide on the research design, we're setting the research agenda. And we need to make sure that we're doing so in a way that is truly inclusive of all the people out there, and that our research projects don't just reflect people like us and our friends. Thank you.
Thanks, Eszter. Okay, Bill's just going to act as respondent, and then we'll have time for some questions.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'm not sure I can get this across. I don't know I didn't know anything more about Eszter's talk than you did, so. But I'd like to try to pull the two talks together a bit, because I think, in one sense, I think Eszter's talk really brought home the continuity over time of key issues. So the issues of the internet, good or bad, the socioeconomic status, the importance of networking, and authenticity, and so forth. So I'd like to say something about that, but and these issues are continuing, they don't go away. But I think what the contingency is the context is completely different. That is, things have changed dramatically. And I'll tie that to Lisa's notion. Whether or not you accept this Lisa's notion of the Facebook as like a state, or I think another way of putting it is the internet is becoming increasingly significant. And in the, that's the big thing. In 2000, it was innovation that really very few politicians paid attention to. It was something that was interesting, and all of these issues were around in 2000. The internet, good or bad, we continue to talk about that. I think I would disagree with you a bit on the, I don't think the paradigm of good, bad, the internet and how they intertwine is, I think we've moved on, and I think more and more people are looking at various features of the internet, like privacy settings and the deleting of pages, or the nature of very specific aspects of the internet are being focused on, rather than the internet as a whole. But still, the debate about the internet being good or bad is still around. This is much of the popular rhetoric. It didn't matter, it was sort of an interesting cocktail party chatter in 2000. Now, it is about public policy reactions now, because of the significance of the internet in many ways. It's determining whether or not regulatory responses are going to be brought in to regulate the internet, and like broadcasting, or like other media and so forth. So huge significance now in terms of how this debate plays out, while before it was more of an academic issue of technological determinism and so forth. SES matters. In 1984, I was writing about the digital divide in personal computing, and how when 14% of Americans had access to PCs, and how it was gendered and income-based and so forth. And everybody said, well, wait a couple of years and it will disappear. And so I always love any reminder that SES, socioeconomic status, still matters. Our recent research, the next iCS report will be out in a few weeks, and key finding of that is that we find this new generation of internet users, what we call next generation users, who are using 3 or more devices, and some of those are mobile. And the combination of that, 44% of Britons we classify as next generation users. And the internet is far more integrated in their day-to-day life and work. They are more predominantly men, and they are more predominantly high income. And it's so that a new digital divide is emerging in terms of what I call the next generation user. So it's not going away. It's actually each new generation of technology matters. Networking. I mean, gosh, in 2000, networking was cool. We'd argue about a virtual community. Is that a silly term or a utopian idea and so forth? Now, the Arab uprisings, the England riots, this is really serious, where politicians are really seriously thinking about kill switches and trying to cut people off, disconnect users. So, again, laugh, but it's significance. It's like the internet has become a central tool, and 40% of Britons, and particularly the next generation users in Britain, say that the internet is essential to their everyday information needs and so forth. So the internet is becoming too important not to address through policy. And authenticity, again, in the 2000s, I think it's really quite, I love your example of concerns over the authenticity of a page, the value of a page. But remember, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was like the internet was a big garbage heap. And that was the usual rhetoric about the internet being a garbage heap, where you might find something of value here and there. But with search and with social networks, more giving reference to people, it's become maybe too trusted, and I take that. But there's a degree to, perhaps that's why social networks are becoming more important in referencing people to pages. People are becoming less trusting of some aspects of search engines. So in skill, again, it's more important than ever that we address issues that we'll sort of that are manipulatable, that we can address. And I would only add, in addition to skill, people's attitudes about the internet. Because still, it's not only skills or literacy, but it's actually people suffering just not being interested in the internet that undermines their use and creates a divide.